Jake Walker's hands were stained with years of oil and grit, the kind of dirt that doesn't wash off with just soap and water. It becomes part of your skin, like a second layer you wear without pride or shame. Each morning, he arrived at the garage before the sun broke the horizon, unlocking the heavy rolling door with a metal groan that echoed through the empty street. The building itself had seen better days. A faded red and white sign above read, Jake's Auto Service, with one corner dangling precariously by a rusted screw. The concrete floor inside was cracked and stained, marked by decades of oil leaks and tire treads like the fingerprints of every soul that had come through its doors. Inside, the air was a mix of exhaust fumes, engine grease, and old coffee, a scent that Jake had come to associate with survival. At 37, Jake carried the weight of a life that had demanded too much too soon. He wasn't always this way. There was a time when he had hope in his eyes and a spring in his step, when he and his wife Sarah would dance barefoot in the living room of their tiny 2-bedroom apartment while their baby boy jiggled from his playpen. Those memories now felt like distant echoes, bittersweet shadows that haunted his quietest moments. Sarah had been his anchor, his reason for believing in something more than paychecks and bills. But when a drunk driver ran a red light one rainy evening, that belief shattered into glass and sirens. One moment she was there, calling to say she'd be home late from her shift at the diner, and the next she was gone. No last words. No final embrace, just an officer at the door with a solemn face and a hat held to his chest. Jake remembered how numb he had felt as he tried to explain to little Liam, who was just 6 at the time, that mommy wouldn't be coming home. How do you tell a child that the center of their universe has collapsed? How do you prepare for the kind of silence that follows a permanent goodbye? Jake didn't cry then, not in front of Liam. He waited until the house was dark and quiet, and then he let the grief choke him in the darkness. Since then, every day had been a quiet battle against loneliness, against guilt, against the unrelenting pressure of being everything for someone when you feel like you're nothing yourself. The garage was more than just a business. It was a sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the clatter of tools and the rhythm of repair. Machines were easier to understand than people. They broke, yes, but you could fix them. Replace a part, tighten a bolt, flush the system, and suddenly they purred again. People weren't like that. Hearts didn't come with schematics. Loss didn't have a manual, yet this was the life he had built, one wrench at a time, with blistered hands and sleepless nights. Money was always tight. The shop barely covered the basics: rent, utilities, Liam's school supplies. Jake often skipped breakfast, pretending he wasn't hungry when Liam asked why he wasn't eating. They shared a 2-room apartment above the garage, which was both a blessing and a curse. It saved on rent, but it meant Liam had to fall asleep to the sounds of grinding metal and classic rock playing from an old radio that Jake used to drown out the noise in his head. Still, Jake made sure Liam never felt poor. Every dollar spent was a choicey school trip or new shoes, healthy groceries or gas for the truck. But Jake didn't complain. He couldn't afford to. That morning was cold, and the heater had finally given up, leaving their small space chilly enough that Liam huddled under 2 blankets while Jake made instant oatmeal on the hot plate. "Dad, do we still have money for my science fair project?" Liam asked, hopeful eyes peering over his spoon. Jake forced a smile. "Of course we do, buddy. You just tell me what you need and we'll get it." Inside, he was already doing the math. How much overtime he'd need to work, what bills could be delayed, which tools he could maybe pawn and buy back later. After walking Liam to the school bus, Jake returned to the garage and began his day. A tune up for Mrs. Rangel's beat-up Toyota, and oil change for a retired trucker's ancient Chevy. Each job earned him just enough to keep the lights on. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve, sweat mixing with grime. The bell above the garage door hadn't rung in over an hour, and Jake was starting to worry. No jobs meant no income. No income meant, well, he didn't like to finish that thought. He stepped outside for a breath, watching his own foggy breath in the air. Just then, a shrill screech sliced through the quiet, a sound no car should ever make. Turning quickly, he saw a bright red Mustang lurch into the lot, sputtering like it was gasping for air. Steam rose from under the hood, and the vehicle rolled to a clumsy stop near the bay. Jake hurried forward. Behind the wheel was a woman with shoulder-length chestnut hair tucked behind sunglasses that seemed too glamorous for this side of town. Her jaw was tight with frustration, and she pounded the steering wheel once before opening the door. Jake approached cautiously. "Rough morning," he offered, his voice calm and even. The woman exhaled sharply. "You could say that? I was on my way to a meeting, and now my car decides to throw a tantrum." Jake smiled slightly, peering at the hood. "Let me take a look." She stepped aside, arms folded tightly across her chest. Jake noticed the designer coat, the fine leather shoes, the sleek phone she clutched with perfectly manicured fingers. She didn't belong here, and yet she was standing there, vulnerable, waiting for help. Jake lifted the hood and was immediately hit with a plume of hot air. "You've got a busted radiator hose," he said after a moment. "That's why she's steaming. I can fix it, but I'll need about an hour." The woman nodded, lips pursed. "I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Jake shrugged. "Not unless you feel like pushing it to your meeting." She let out a reluctant laugh, just a breathy chuckle really, but it was the first sign of warmth he'd seen. "Emma," she said, extending a hand. "Jake," he replied, shaking it. Her grip was firm, but her fingers trembled ever so slightly. Jake wondered what kind of stress she was under. Something told him it wasn't just the car. As he got to work, Emma paced back and forth, phone pressed to her ear as she mumbled to whoever was on the other end. She seemed efficient, commanding, but also tired, really tired. Jake stole a glance now and then as he tightened clamps and replaced the hose. She wasn't just some wealthy woman with car trouble. There was something deeper behind the sunglasses, something she was trying to hide. While the engine cooled, he offered her coffee from the thermos he kept in the back. She hesitated, then accepted it gratefully. "You have a kid?" she asked, noticing the photo on the wall inside the garage. A smiling boy in a superhero costume holding a wrench. Jake nodded. "That's Liam, 10 going on 30. He wants to build rockets someday." Emma smiled.
That's ambitious.
Jake looked at the ground. "Yeah, well, kids should be allowed to dream, even if their dads are just mechanics scraping by." Emma looked at him, something softening in her eyes. "You do more than scrape by, Jake. You show up. That counts for something." Jake wasn't used to compliments. They made him feel exposed. He shrugged again, playing it off. "Just doing what I can." The hour passed quickly, and soon the Mustang was purring like new. Jake walked her through what he'd done, explained how to keep an eye on the temperature gauge, and gave her a few free tips. When she reached into her purse for her wallet, he stopped her. "It's on the house?" he said simply. She stared at him. "What?" "No, I insist." "Really?" Jake said. "You had a rough day." "I'm just glad I could help." Emma didn't know what to say. No one ever turned down her money. No one did anything without an angle. But Jake just stood there, wiping his hands with a rag, already turning back to his work. She slipped into the driver's seat, but before starting the engine, she looked back at him one last time. "Thank you, Jake." He gave a modest nod, drive safe. As the red Mustang pulled away, Jake stood alone in the driveway, wind tussling his hair. He didn't know that the woman he had just helped was Emma Carrington, owner of Carrington Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. He didn't know that his simple act of kindness would soon ripple across his entire life. He only knew that for one brief moment, he'd made someone's day just a little bit better. And in a world full of hard days, that was enough. Emma Carrington gripped the steering wheel of her red Mustang with more force than necessary as she pulled out of Jake's garage. Her foot hovered lightly over the gas pedal, but her mind was far away, replaying every word, every gesture, every detail of the man who had just fixed her car. The rumble of the engine beneath her was smooth again, like it had never faltered, yet the unsettled storm within her had only grown louder. She drove slowly at first, as if putting distance between her and that humble garage would somehow quiet the strange tug in her chest. But it didn't. Emma Carrington was not used to being unknown. Her face had graced the covers of major business magazines. She had been a keynote speaker at international tech conferences. Headlines praised her brilliance, her rise from a college dropout to a tech mogul who built Carrington Enterprises from a dingy apartment into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. In most places, people knew her name before she introduced herself. Her polished look, the designer heels, the unmistakable confidence. These were her armor, her identity, her currency in a world that revered power. And yet Jake hadn't recognized her at all. That was new and unsettling and strangely comforting. He'd looked at her not as an opportunity, not as someone to impress or court or flatter. He'd looked at her like she was just another person needing help. And the help he gave, without expectation, without posturing, was real. It was human. And it rattled something inside her that had been dormant for far too long. Her fingers trembled as she reached into the center console and pulled out her phone. Dozens of unread messages blinked across the screen. Emails from board members, texts from her assistant reminding her of meetings, alerts about stock prices and market shifts. She was supposed to be on her way to a quarterly review with investors. Instead, she found herself taking a detour, not just from the meeting, but from the person she had been trained to be. She swiped all the notifications away in one motion, silencing the demands of her empire with the same instinct that had led her to Jake's garage. The cityscape shimmered behind her in the rearview mirror as she drove toward the outskirts, where the buildings gave way to trees and open spaces. It had been years since she'd been out this way, since she allowed herself a pause that wasn't tied to strategy or branding. She passed neighborhoods that time had forgotten, brick buildings with peeling paint and mom, and pop shops that still fought against the tide of corporate chains. She spotted a park, quiet, with only a few people walking dogs or sitting on benches. She pulled in without a plan, parked under a wide oak tree, and let the engine fall silent. Emma sat in the car for a long moment, her hands resting on her lap. The coffee Jake had offered her earlier still sat in the cup holder. She picked it up, brought it to her lips, and sipped. It wasn't anything fancy. No almond milk, no vanilla shot, no triple foam like the baristas at her headquarters cafe made. But it was warm, and it reminded her of simpler times. When she finally stepped out of the car, the late morning sun greeted her with a gentleness she hadn't noticed in months. She made her way to a bench beneath the oak tree and sat down, letting the breeze tug at her coat and hair. The world felt different here, slower, more honest. She thought about Jake again. She thought about his eyes, tired but kind. The way he spoke of his son, not with bitterness, but with reverence. She thought about the photo of Liam on the garage wall, about the way Jake had refused her money. No one refused her money, not even charities, and especially not strangers. But Jake had, not with arrogance, but with quiet conviction. And that, more than anything, had stopped her in her tracks. Emma reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook. She always carried it, not because she needed it for work, but because every now and then she liked to write by hand. It was something her mother used to do. Her mother had been a teacher before cancer stole her from the world, and Emma had inherited her love of words and her obsession with yellow pencils. She flipped open to a clean page and began to write. Today I met someone who reminded me what real strength looks like. Not the kind that dominates boardrooms or shatters glass ceilings. The kind that shows up every day in grease-stained coveralls with a broken heart and a steady hand. She paused, chewing the tip of the pencil. A couple passed by with a golden retriever that barked at a squirrel. She smiled at the innocence of it all. Then she went back to writing. I don't know what made me take that street today. I never go that way. But maybe I was supposed to. Maybe the universe is more intentional than I give it credit for. Jake Walker doesn't know who I am, and maybe that's a gift. For the first time in years, I wasn't a CEO or a public figure. I was just a woman with car trouble, and he was just a man who helped. Her thoughts drifted to Liam. She had never had children. There simply hadn't been time. Her relationships had all suffered under the weight of her ambition. She had always told herself there would be time later. But lately, later had started to feel like a cruel lie. Watching Jake speak about his son with such devotion stirred something she hadn't expected, a longing for connection, for meaning beyond balance sheets and acquisition deals. She remembered how Liam's photo had been taped to the wall with worn corners, surrounded by little crayon drawings and sticky notes. The garage had been messy, but it felt like home. It had soul, and Jake had built it with nothing but hard work and heartache. He was the kind of man who didn't have the luxury of dreaming big, and yet he gave his son permission to believe in rockets. That struck her deeply. She pulled out her phone again and hovered her finger over the screen. She could look him up. She had access to databases, public records, facial recognition tech, tools that most people couldn't even imagine. But she didn't want to? Not yet. She didn't want to see a background check. She wanted to see him, the real him, unfiltered, untouched by expectation or assumptions. So instead, she opened a blank email to herself and began to type. Subject: Jake Walker, the man who fixed more than my car. And then a flood of thoughts poured out. She wrote about how his garage smelled of coffee and resilience, how his hands were cracked from years of labor but steady and precise, how his voice was calm even as she panicked, how he had offered her comfort without pity, kindness without condition. She wrote about the wrench he held like it was an extension of himself, about the way he spoke to her, not as a woman to impress, but as a person to help. Emma found herself crying softly, not from sadness, but from something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: gratitude. Gratitude for a man who had no idea he just saved someone from drowning in a life that looked perfect on paper, but felt hollow in the marrow. By the time she looked up, the sun had moved across the sky. Hours had passed without her noticing. Her phone buzzed again. Another calendar alert, another missed meeting. But she didn't feel the panic she usually did. For once, the world could wait. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the send button. Then she saved the draft and closed the phone. She wasn't ready to share it, not yet. But she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't done with Jake Walker, not even close. She stood, brushing leaves from her coat, and looked back at her car. It gleamed in the sunlight, freshly repaired, reliable again. But something inside her had changed. She didn't want to go back to the penthouse tonight. She didn't want to face the sterile walls of her office or the endless barrage of business pitches. She wanted to hear Liam's laugh. She wanted to know what Jake cooked for dinner. She wanted to sit in that garage again and watch a man fix things. Not just cars, but moments. As she slid into the driver's seat, she made a quiet vow to herself. She would find a way back into that world slowly, carefully, authentically. Not as Emma Carrington, CEO of Carrington Enterprises, but as Emma, the woman who once believed in dreams, who used to sing to the radio while driving through the countryside, who missed her mother and regretted never telling her how much her teaching had shaped her life. Emma wasn't sure where this road would take her. She didn't know what she was hoping to find. But for the first time in a long time, she was willing to follow the feeling, to risk being vulnerable, to rediscover what it meant to be seen. And so she drove, not towards skyscrapers and boardrooms, but towards something quieter, more honest. Toward a garage that smelled of coffee and old memories. Toward a man with calloused hands and a boy who believed in rockets. Jake didn't think much of the woman in the red Mustang after she left. Not at first. Anyway, life didn't leave much room for reflection when you were a single dad with an overflowing inbox, a pile of car parts on order, and bills that always seemed to arrive a few days earlier than the money to pay them. He had learned over the years to live in the moment because looking too far ahead only reminded him of everything he couldn't fix. The Mustang had pulled away, her taillights vanishing around the corner like a brief memory. He watched it disappear through the garage's dusty front window, then turned back to the worn countertop where his tools lay scattered. There was always another car to fix, another muffler to weld, another oil change to finish before sundown. He slipped his gloves back on, picked up his wrench, and buried himself in work because that's what he knew. That's what kept the fear at bay. The fear of failing his son, of being just another man left behind by life. But later that night, after Liam had come home from school, after dinner was eaten and the dishes were washed and put away, something shifted. Liam was sitting at the old kitchen table, his brow furrowed as he worked through a math worksheet, his tongue poked slightly out of the corner of his mouth in concentration, a little quirk he had inherited from his mother. Jake stood by the sink drying a plate, but his hands slowed, his eyes drifting toward the counter where an ordinary paper coffee cup sat quietly beside a napkin. She had left it behind. It wasn't fancy, just one of those plain cardboard cups with a brown sleeve, but there was something about it, something that felt like a timestamp in his day. A frozen moment that refused to melt into the background. He reached out and picked it up, turning it gently in his hand, as if it might offer answers to questions he wasn't even aware he'd been asking. He wasn't sure why it lingered in his thoughts. He had seen hundreds of customers pass through that garage, some grateful, some rude, some chatty, most indifferent. But she had been different, not just because of the car, though the Mustang was something special, but because of her eyes. They had been tired, yes, but not just the tiredness that comes from lack of sleep. It was a deeper exhaustion, one that came from carrying too many secrets, too many expectations. Her eyes had searched his face like she was hoping to find something there that even she didn't fully understand. "Dad?" Liam's voice broke the silence. Jake blinked and looked over. "Who was that lady?" Jake shrugged, trying to sound casual, but his voice came out a bit softer than usual. "Just someone who needed a little help." Liam tilted his head with that curious smile that Jake had come to treasure. "She looked like a movie star?" Jakey chuckled, tussling his son's hair as he passed by. "Maybe she was," he said, half joking. but all I saw was someone with a busted water pump. Liam laughed and went back to his homework, but Jake couldn't shake the memory. It wasn't just her appearance, though she had a presence about her, a kind of quiet strength that suggested she was used to making things happen. No, it was more than that. It was the way she had looked a picture of Liam on the wall, the way she had paused, really paused, and studied it like it meant something to her. People didn't usually do that. They glanced, maybe smiled politely, but she had truly seen it. Seen Liam, seen Jake. After Liam had gone to bed, Jake stayed up, sorting through a stack of invoices in the living room. The old couch creaked beneath him as he shifted, trying to find a comfortable spot. The television was on low volume in the background, playing reruns of a sitcom he wasn't really watching. Every now and then, he glanced at the coffee cup on the table beside him. He thought about how her voice had trembled slightly when she first walked into the garage. Not out of fear, more like she was holding back something heavy, maybe grief, maybe regret, or maybe just the weight of trying to hold it all together. Jake had known that feeling well. After Laura, his wife, passed away, he had spent months pretending to be strong for Liam's sake, smiling when he didn't feel like it, working overtime when his body begged him to rest, going to bed every night with an ache in his chest and a prayer on his lips that he'd somehow find the strength to do it all again tomorrow. He didn't like to dwell on the past. It was too dangerous. Regret was a cruel visitor. It always stayed longer than it was welcome and left behind bitterness when it finally left. But sometimes, like tonight, the memories slipped in through the cracks. The ache in his hands reminded him of years spent gripping a wrench to pay rent. The scars on his knuckles told stories of late nights under cars with failing light bulbs and frozen bolts. But the picture of Liam taped to the fridge, that was the anchor that kept him from drifting too far. He leaned back and closed his eyes, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the wall clock. He thought about the way she had looked at him. No judgment, no impatience, just curiosity and maybe something else. Empathy. Jake wasn't used to being seen like that. Most people saw a grease-stained mechanic and moved on, but she hadn't. She had stayed, asked questions, listened, and then she had offered to pay more than he had expected. He had refused, not because he didn't need the money, he did, but because something about taking it had felt wrong. Like it would have cheapened the moment, like it would have turned something real into just another transaction. Maybe that's what bothered him most. The moment had felt real, genuine, and real moments were rare. The next morning, Jake woke early as he always did. The alarm buzzed at 6 a.m., and he swung his legs over the side of the bed with a groan. His back ached, and his shoulders were stiff, but there was work to be done. Always work. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake Liam, and padded into the kitchen to start the coffee. The cup was still on the table. He stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up and tossed it in the trash. But the feeling it left behind, that strange sense of unfinished business, lingered. Later that day, after dropping Liam off at school, Jake returned to the garage and opened up for business. The air smelled of rubber and motor oil, familiar and grounding. He rolled up the bay doors, let in the morning light, and began his routine. Check inventory, review the appointment book, return calls. Another day, another grind. But every time the door opened, his heart did a little stutter, wondering if she might walk in again. She didn't. By mid-afternoon, he told himself to forget about it, to move on. She was probably just passing through. Rich people always had places to be. Maybe she was already back in some high-rise office, sipping espresso from a platinum cup and forgetting all about the small-town mechanic who replaced her water pump. Still, as he wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the counter, he allowed himself one last thought. What if she wasn't? He didn't know her name. He didn't even know where she was headed. But she had left something behind, not just the coffee cup, but something less tangible.
A question.
A feeling. A glimpse of something that might have been in another life under different stars. And despite everything, Jake couldn't help but wonder, what if this wasn't the end of their story? What if it was just the beginning? Jake couldn't say what had changed exactly, but something inside him had. Ever since she'd walked into his life with a broken down car and a mysterious smile, his world hadn't quite settled back into the usual routine. He still woke early, still made coffee in the dented percolator with the handle missing, still packed Liam's lunch with a folded napkin note, and zipped up his jacket before the bus came. He still got to the garage at sunrise and left long after sunset. But now there was a pause in his rhythm, an almost imperceptible beat that waited for her. He caught himself glancing toward the street more than he meant to. Every time he heard a car slow outside the shop, he looked up. He never said he was hoping to see her again. Not even to himself. But the ache in his chest when it wasn't her said enough. He didn't have a phone number. Didn't even know her last name. All he had was a memory wrapped in the smell of motor oil and the glint of an unlikely smile. And the strange sense that when she had driven away that day, she'd taken something with her that he hadn't even known he'd offered. The third morning after her visit, he was elbow deep in a busted alternator when the bell above the garage door jingled. Not the metal rattle of a customer, but softer. Slower. He looked up, and there she was. She wasn't in a tailored coat this time. No heels, no polished red lipstick or mirrored sunglasses. Just jeans, a simple sweater, and a paper bag in one hand. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and she looked like someone who had stepped out of a dream he'd never let himself have. "I brought lunch," she said, raising the bag with a small smile. Jake blinked. "For me." "Well, unless you have someone else hiding in here," she teased, glancing around at the empty garage. He chuckled, wiped his hands on the nearest rag, and walked toward her. "What'd I do to deserve this? You fixed my car, and you didn't treat me like someone who needed rescuing. I didn't treat you like someone rich, either," he added with a hint of playfulness. Her smile faltered for just a second, but not in a bad way, more like someone who'd been seen through for the first time. She handed him the bag, and he led her back to the office where the little round table was usually covered in bills and receipts. Today it was cleared Jake had done that yesterday, just in case. They sat unwrapping the sandwiches in silence, the sound of the nearby street fading behind them. She handed him one along with a cold bottle of iced tea. "No fancy cafe labels," she said. "Made it myself." He took a bite and nodded appreciatively. "You make a good sandwich." "I make a great sandwich," she corrected with a smirk. The room was warm with sunlight filtering through the old blinds, and for a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Jake found he didn't need to fill the silence. Not with her. It was the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty, safe rather than awkward. After a few bites, she leaned back in her chair and looked around. "It's quieter than I thought it'd be." "Slow day," he replied. "But I don't mind. Gives me time to pretend I'm organized." She nodded toward a cluttered drawer hanging open. "You're doing great." They both laughed, and just like that, the last bits of stiffness melted away. They talked about simple things at first. Jake told her how Liam had built a rocket ship out of shoeboxes and wanted to be a scientist. She told him about a dog she'd had as a child who used to bark at elevator doors. He told her about the time he got stranded in a snowstorm with nothing but a donut spare and a thermos of soup. She told him about her favorite place to watch the sunrise. It was on the roof of a building most people didn't know she owned. Little by little, the walls between their worlds cracked. He didn't ask about her job.
Not directly.
But eventually she said, I work in investments. Like stocks and stuff. She nodded. Something like that. That sounds stressful.
You have no idea?
And he believed her. When she spoke about the city, her voice had an edge. Not sharp, not bitter, but tired. As if she'd grown used to standing with her back to a wall. Jake knew that feeling. The need to always be on guard. To prove you belonged. He just hadn't expected to find it in someone who seemed to have everything. How do you deal with all that? He asked. She looked down at her bottle of iced tea, rolling it between her palms. I didn't always. There were years I didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night. I forgot how to laugh, forgot what it felt like to be still. He watched her closely.
And now she met his eyes.
No, I'm trying to remember. There was a pause, soft, but heavy. Jake wanted to reach out to take her hand, but he didn't. Not yet. He was a man who knew the value of timing. And right now, just being present was enough. You're a good listener, she said suddenly. Jake shrugged. Comes with being a mechanic. Most people talk when they're waiting for their car. You learn to listen or go crazy. She smiled again, but this one was smaller, sadder. I don't think anyone's really listened to me in a long time. Jake's chest ached with something he didn't have a name for. He thought of how often people must see her name on paper, in headlines, in contracts, but not as a person, just a symbol, an empire, an icon, but never just Amelia. He didn't know he was falling. She didn't know she was healing. When lunch was finished, she helped him toss the wrappers and clear the table. No hesitation. No diva behavior. Just simple gestures that made the space feel less like a workplace and more like a home. Thank you, she said before leaving. For what? For reminding me that the world's still real, that people like you still exist. Jakey watched her walk to her car again. This time, he didn't feel the silence as deeply, because he knew it wouldn't be the last time. She came back again 3 days later, this time with coffee, then again on a rainy Thursday. No excuse, just wanted to say hi, and slowly their conversations grew deeper. He told her about his wife, how she had passed after a long illness, how it had broken him in ways he hadn't admitted out loud. He told her how Liam still talked about her in the present tense, how hard it was to correct him. She listened, truly listened, with eyes that didn't flinch, with silence that held space for his grief. She told him about the price of success, about nights she'd cried in the back of a limo and wiped her tears before anyone could see. She told him about her father, how he had taught her everything and then left before she could say thank you, about the loneliness that comes with having more than everyone but feeling less than anyone. He didn't offer advice. He didn't try to fix it. He just said, I'm here. And that was enough. One evening as the sun set and the garage closed early for the first time in months, they sat on the hood of an old Chevy he'd been meaning to restore for years. The sky turned to watercolor and the first stars blinked awake. She looked at him and said, I think I was meant to break down here. Jake looked over at her, the wind tugging gently at her hair.
Why is that?
Because I think I was going the wrong direction, and you were the sign I didn't know I needed. He didn't speak, just nodded, because he knew exactly what she meant. That night, after she drove away, Jake tucked Liam into bed, washed the last dish in the sink, and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold. And he let himself admit what he hadn't dared say aloud until now. He didn't just hope she'd come back. He needed her to. 1 week turned into 2, then 3. What began as a single chance meeting over a broken down car was quietly transforming into something neither Jake nor Amelia could fully describe, but both were slowly learning to trust. She kept coming back, not out of obligation or curiosity, but with a sincerity that could be felt in the way she paused before walking in, like she was breathing in the moment before entering a space that had somehow become sacred. Sometimes she stayed for hours, sometimes only for a few minutes, but she always came. And each time, Jake felt something shift, not just in the air, but within himself. It was as if her presence filled up all the spaces in his life that had been echoing with silence for too long. The garage became a sanctuary, no longer just a place where engines were fixed, but where hearts began to heal. She would bring coffee some mornings, pastries on Fridays, and once even showed up with a small radio saying, "This place needs music." The tinny sounds of old Motown records now played softly in the background as they worked or talked or simply sat without needing to speak. Jake found himself watching the clock, not because he was waiting for a customer, but because he had started to anticipate the moment she might walk through the door. And Liam had become enchanted. He started calling her the pretty lady, always asking when she would visit again and saving up drawings to give her. Amelia, in turn, kept every scribble like it was a treasure, folding them carefully and tucking them into her purse with a smile that looked less rehearsed every time. It was the small things that slowly became everything. Amelia helped Jake sort through years of rusted tools and tangled wires, turning the dusty garage into something halfway presentable. She painted a dull, forgotten corner of the office bright yellow and laughed when she got more on herself than on the wall. She even brought Liam a book on paper airplanes and spent an entire Saturday showing him how to fold them just right until the garage floor was covered in flying contraptions that soared, dipped, and crashed amid peals of laughter. With each visit, the laughter came more easily. The silences felt less heavy. The weight Jake had carried, the grief, the guilt, the endless pressure of being everything for his son began to loosen, as if her mere presence lightened the burden he hadn't realized he was still holding so tightly. She never pressed him to talk, but she always listened when he did. She never pitied him, never treated him like a broken man. And in that, she gave him space to remember who he had been before the world had turned so dark. Jake didn't ask why she kept coming back. He didn't need to. Some truths didn't need to be said out loud. It was enough to know that when she was around, the world felt softer. The sharp edges dulled. He began to believe in things again, not in grand gestures or sweeping fairy tales, but in quiet kindnesses, in shared meals, in glances that lingered just a second longer than necessary. One particularly windy evening, they sat outside the garage beneath the flickering pale glow of the overhead lights. The air smelled of rain and gasoline, and Amelia sat on the hood of his old pickup with her legs swinging slightly over the edge. She looked up at the stars, only a few visible through the haze of city light, and then down at Jake, who was elbow deep in an engine with grease smudged on his cheek. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost unsure. Jake paused, wiped his hands with a rag, and looked up at her. There was something in her eyes, an unspoken story, a wound hidden behind her practiced composure. "I believe," he said slowly, "in moments that make the pain worth it." She didn't reply immediately, just looked at him for a long time. And though she said nothing, Her eyes glistened in the light, and the silence between them said more than words ever could. From that night on, things began to shift in a way neither could ignore. Amelia's visits became less sporadic and more intentional. She started showing up before Jake opened, helping him unlock the doors, make coffee, sweep the front steps. She brought muffins one morning and a new pair of gloves for him another. Nothing expensive, but thoughtful, intentional. Jake, in turn, began to make small changes in the garage. He cleared out a dusty corner and brought in an extra stool. He fixed the old coffee machine. He even found himself humming while he worked, something he hadn't done since his wife was alive. It wasn't just that he was happy. It was that he remembered what it felt like to be seen. There was one afternoon when Amelia arrived late, rushed, flustered, her hair slightly windswept. Jake could tell something was wrong, but he didn't press. Instead, he handed her a cup of warm tea and sat with her on the workbench in silence until her breathing slowed. "They want me to sell a company I built from nothing," she finally said, her voice hollow. "To people who see only numbers, not people, not dreams." Jake didn't respond with business advice. He didn't offer strategies or solutions. He just reached over and gently placed his hand over hers. "You built something that mattered. Don't let them take that from you." She turned to him, eyes wide. "You don't even know what it is?" "I don't need to," he replied. "I know you." That was the moment, the one where the air between them changed. Not just full of potential, but full of promise. Later that week, Jake closed the shop early. He didn't tell Amelia why. He just asked her to trust him. She showed up in jeans and sneakers, curious. He drove her and Lam an hour out of town to a quiet field by the river. They roasted marshmallows, watched the sun dip below the horizon, and lay on their backs staring at the stars. Liam fell asleep in the back of the truck, his small body curled up in a blanket. Amelia leaned her head on Jake's shoulder, and for a long while they just sat like that. No words, no pretense, only the sound of water and wind and the gentle beat of two hearts, remembering what it was to be open again. In the following days, the community started noticing. People who'd known Jake for years, who had seen him as the quiet, hardworking single dad with sad eyes and calloused hands, began to see something new. A lightness in his step, a quiet smile when no one was looking. And when Amelia joined him at the farmer's market one Saturday, walking beside him and Liam like she belonged there, no one dared ask questions. They just smiled back. Jake's mother, who rarely left her small cottage 2 towns over, even called to say she had a feeling something good was happening. He laughed and didn't deny it. And still, neither he nor Amelia put a label on what was unfolding between them. They didn't need to. It was in the way she lingered before saying goodbye, in the way he always saved the last piece of pie for her, in the way Liam started calling her Miss Amelia and asking if she could come to his school play. The bond forming between them was rooted in honesty, not perfection, not fairy tales. Just 2 people with scars and stories finding solace in each other. And though neither of them said it, both knew they were slowly becoming each other's safe place. Then, one morning, Amelia stood at the edge of the garage and looked out at the rising sun. Jake walked up behind her, wiping his hands on his apron. "You okay?" he asked. She turned, hesitated, and then said, "I think I want to tell you something." He waited. She looked at him, really looked, and said, "There's more to me than what you've seen. I figured. I'm not who you think I am." Jake tilted his head. "Then tell me who you are." Amelia stepped closer. "You might see me differently. You might not want this anymore." He reached out, brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm not here because of who you were. I'm here because of who you are with me. And just like that, something inside Amelia broke free. Not in a painful way, but in a way that felt like release, like coming home. She didn't tell him everything that day, but she knew she would soon, because this fragile, beautiful thing they were building deserved the truth. And Jake, with all his quiet strength, would be the one to hold it with grace. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of Amelia's penthouse apartment, scattering gold light across the marble floor. The city skyline stretched wide behind her, but her focus was fixed on the reflection in the mirror. Amelia stood in silence, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, her hair loosely tied back. No makeup, no jewelry, no armor. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't getting ready for a board meeting, a charity gala, or a media interview. She was preparing for something far more terrifying: honesty. Her heart thudded as she stared at herself. The woman in the mirror wasn't just the billionaire CEO the world knew. She was the girl who grew up with nothing, who fought for every opportunity, who got hurt and never truly healed. She was the woman who had spent years trying to prove she belonged in a world that chewed people up. And now, she was the woman who had stumbled upon a mechanic's garage and found something more valuable than her entire empire: peace, belonging, and the gentle love of a man who saw her, not her net worth. Today, that man would learn the truth. She had rehearsed the words a dozen times on the drive to Jake's garage, but now, parked just outside, everything she practiced evaporated. Her palms were sweaty, her chest tight. What if he pulled away? What if everything they'd shared, the late night talks, the laughter, the soft silences, crumbled the moment she peeled back the curtain? But there was no going back. This wasn't just about honesty. It was about choosing to be real, about giving Jake the choice to love her without the illusion. The bell above the garage door jingled as she stepped inside. Jake was under the hood of a faded blue Chevy, sleeves rolled up, grease smeared across his arms. The sight of him, so grounded and unpretentious, made her heart ache in a way she couldn't quite explain. He looked up, and when their eyes met, he smiled, not the polite kind, but the kind that warmed the cold corners of her heart. "You're early," he said, setting down a wrench and wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't expect to see you till later." Amelia returned the smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She took a deep breath, walked closer, and said softly, "Can we talk?" Jake nodded immediately, his smile fading as he caught the seriousness in her tone. He motioned toward the small office in the back. Inside, the room was warm and cluttered, the air thick with the scent of oil and old paper. Jake closed the door behind them and leaned against the desk, arms folded, waiting. Amelia didn't sit. She stood in the center of the room, arms at her sides, every muscle tight with nerves. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice shaky. "Something I should have said a long time ago." Jake watched her closely, saying nothing. "I wasn't completely honest with you," she continued. "Not because I wanted to lie, I didn't know how to explain." Still, he said nothing. "I own a company," she said. "A very big company. A global tech conglomerate, actually. It started as a small app I built in my apartment years ago, but it grew fast, too fast. And now, I'm not just Amelia from the garage. I'm Amelia Royce, the CEO of a billion-dollar empire." She paused, waiting for a reaction. Jake blinked, processing, his expression unreadable. "There are boardrooms and investors and press conferences," she went on. "And for years, I've lived in a world where everyone expects me to be this polished, perfect version of myself. But when I met you, it was the first time in years I didn't feel like I could just be me." Jake still didn't speak. He just looked at her, his brow slightly furrowed, his eyes unreadable. "I know it was wrong to keep that from you," she said, her voice cracking. I didn't want to lose what we had. I didn't want you to look at me the way everyone else does. Like I'm made of money, like I'm untouchable." Jake finally moved. He stepped forward slowly until he was standing just inches from her. He looked down into her eyes, searching. "So," he said quietly, "you're still you, right?" She nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I am, I promise." Jake reached out, gently brushing the tear away with his thumb. "Then none of that changes what you mean to me." Amelia's breath hitched. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding on to the fear until it started to dissolve in the warmth of his words. In that tiny office, surrounded by oil-stained walls and the hum of engines outside, something rare happened: acceptance. Not of her wealth or her status, but of her. She sat down then, her knees trembling, her emotions threatening to spill over. Jake sat across from her, silent for a moment before reaching for her hand. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusing. "Because I didn't know if you'd still see me," she admitted. "Not just the woman standing in front of you, but the person underneath all the noise. Most people don't. They see the headlines, the numbers, but you saw me." Jakey nodded slowly. "I did, and I still do." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped, hearts thudding in rhythm. The tension melted into something softer, something unspoken but deeply understood. Jake wasn't angry. He wasn't intimidated. If anything, he admired her more. "I've fixed a lot of broken things," he said finally. "Cars, engines, even my own heart. But you walked in here like a gust of wind and reminded me I was still alive. I don't care how many billions you have. I care about how you look at my son like he matters. I care about how you laugh when you get paint on your nose. I care about the woman who sat on the hood of my truck and talked about second chances." Amelia wiped her eyes, unable to hold back the tears now. Jake smiled gently. "Besides, Liam already thinks you're some kind of superhero. Now I guess he's technically right." That made her laugh, soft, genuine, the kind that came from deep within. Later that evening, as they sat on the front steps of the garage watching Liam ride his bike in uneven circles, Amelia leaned her head on Jake's shoulder. "I've never been this scared," she confessed. "Good," Jake replied. "That means it's real." They stayed like that for a long time, watching the sun dip below the trees, listening to Liam's laughter echo across the empty lot. And for the first time in her life, Amelia Royce, the CEO, the public figure, the billionaire, felt truly, deeply, entirely human and entirely loved. In the days that followed, the world outside kept turning. The company board grew restless. Journalists speculated on her whereabouts. Stock prices shifted, but none of that mattered to her, not anymore. She had found something more valuable than quarterly earnings and power lunches. She found Jake, and he had taught her the most important lesson of all. Love doesn't care about your bank account. It cares about who shows up, who listens, who stays. And Jake had stayed. As for Liam, he simply saw the world in black and white. Amelia made his dad smile. She brought him books and taught him how to fly paper planes. In his eyes, she was magic. One night, after putting Liam to bed, Jake found Amelia standing in the doorway, watching the boy sleep. "You changed everything," she whispered, "and you didn't even know it." Jake walked over, wrapped his arms around her, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "No," he whispered back. "You just finally showed someone who you really are, and I'm lucky I got to see it first." In that quiet moment, in a small house with peeling paint and creaky floors, Two people from vastly different worlds stood side by side, not as a billionaire and a mechanic, but as two souls brave enough to find each other. Because love doesn't follow rules, it follows truth, and they had finally found theirs. The seasons changed quietly, without announcement. Summer slipped into fall, bringing golden leaves and a crispness in the air that made everything feel more alive. Life didn't come to a dramatic climax. Instead, it settled into something steady and meaningful. Jake and Amelia, once strangers bound by a broken car and unexpected compassion, had become something rare. Two people committed not just to each other, but to something bigger than themselves. In the mornings, Jake still opened the garage like clockwork. He greeted customers with his signature warm smile and worked tirelessly to keep old engines alive. But now, his eyes carried something new, a brightness, a joy that hadn't been there before, the kind that only came from peace, from love, from purpose. Amelia was by his side more often now. She'd help Liam with homework in the garage's dusty back office or bring sandwiches for the crew during busy days. Sometimes she'd just sit, her laptop open, typing away while Jake worked nearby, and every so often they'd exchange a glance, a silent reminder of where they'd been and what they were building. Liam, ever curious and full of energy, had flourished under Amelia's gentle guidance. He called her Mia, now a name that had started as a slip of the tongue but stuck like glue. It made Amelia's heart ache in the best way. She didn't push, didn't try to replace anyone in his life. She just showed up day after day with kindness and patience, and he welcomed her with the open arms only a child could offer. Jake noticed the way Liam's eyes lit up whenever Amelia walked in. It reminded him of something he hadn't dared believe in for years: hope. It was one of those mellow Saturdays, the kind where everything felt slower and softer, when a man in a tailored suit showed up at the garage. He didn't look like someone who needed his oil changed. He carried a leather briefcase and introduced himself politely to Jake, asking if they could speak in private. Jake raised an eyebrow but led him to the office, curious. The man's name was Thomas. He was a lawyer. More specifically, a representative of the Royce Foundation, something Jake had never heard of. Thomas explained that the foundation was newly established, created in Jake's name, with a very specific purpose to support single parents, especially fathers who were trying to rebuild their lives. The initiative included scholarships for technical training, housing assistance, and mental health resources. It was all backed by a very significant endowment. Jake blinked at the man, unsure he'd heard correctly. "I think you have the wrong guy," he said, shaking his head. "I didn't start any foundation." Thomas smiled, sliding a file across the table. "You didn't. But someone who cares about you did." Jake's hands trembled as he opened the folder and saw Amelia's signature on the bottom of every page. A lump formed in his throat. This wasn't just a kind gesture, it was a legacy. That night, Jake stood on the porch of their home, staring up at the stars. Amelia joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. He turned slowly to face her, the file still in his hands. "You did this?" he asked softly. She nodded, not quite sure how he'd react. Jake looked down at the papers again, then back at her.
Why?
Amelia exhaled slowly. "Because the world needs more people like you. And because I know what it's like to feel invisible, to carry everything alone. This is how I want to use what I've been given. Not for board meetings or PR campaigns, for people like you." Jake looked away, overwhelmed. "I didn't do this for thanks," he whispered. "I know," Amelia replied, stepping closer. "That's why you deserve it." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind rustling through the trees above them. Then Jake leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his heart full. The foundation launched the following month with a quiet ceremony at the community center downtown. There were no photographers, no media blitz, just people, real people. Single parents, community leaders, old customers from the garage. Jake stood nervously at the podium, a man who had spent his life avoiding the spotlight. His palms were sweaty, his notes shaking slightly. "I don't know how to make speeches," he said honestly, causing a few chuckles in the crowd. "But I know what it's like to feel lost. I know what it's like to wonder if you're enough. I've made mistakes. I've doubted myself, but someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and that changed everything." He paused, glancing at Amelia, seated in the front row, her eyes glistening. "This foundation isn't about me," he continued. "It's about everyone who's ever felt like they couldn't get back up. It's about second chances. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was full of heart." And as Jake stepped off the stage, Liam ran up to him and threw his arms around his waist.
"That was awesome, Dad,"
he said, beaming. Jake knelt and held him close. "Thanks, buddy." Amelia joined them a moment later, and together they stood as a family, imperfect, untraditional, but deeply connected. Over time, the foundation grew. Jake stayed humble about it, refusing to let the attention change him. He still fixed cars, still helped neighbors, still drove Liam to school every morning. But now, he did it with a quiet pride, knowing he was part of something bigger. Amelia returned to her company with new vision. She reorganized leadership, handed off daily operations, and focused on using her resources to build the things that truly mattered. She found herself on construction sites, at food banks, at community meetings. Not as a figurehead, but as a human being. The transformation wasn't sudden or flashy. It was slow, like dawn breaking after a long night. And it was real. Their story became local legend, then something more. People wrote articles, created podcasts, told friends, not because it was glamorous, but because it was true. A struggling single dad, a broken car, a woman with a secret, and a choice to love, to trust, to build. One evening, as they sat on the garage roof watching the sunset, Jake turned to Amelia. "You know, I used to think my life peaked when I became a dad, that everything else was just surviving." She looked at him, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "But then you came along," he said, "and I realized I was still becoming." Amelia didn't respond with words. She just leaned in and kissed him. Gently, deeply, like someone who knew that love was not in the grand gestures, but in the everyday moments. Below them, the lights of the city began to flicker on. A new day was ending. Another one would begin, and whatever came next, they would face it together, because love had found them under a car hood and behind years of pain. It had shown up in grease, stained shirts, and silent sacrifices. It had survived truth, fear, and transformation. And now it wasn't just a story. It was a legacy. In the end, they learned that the richest lives aren't measured in dollars or in headlines or even in success. They're measured in the hearts we hold, the hands we reach for, and the lives we choose to lift up along the way. Jake and Amelia didn't just fall in love. They built something timeless. And in that, they became truly wealthy.